Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Biblical Bookworm. My name is Elizabeth, and today I'll be talking about the book How to Be Happy, St. Thomas' Secret to a Good Life by Fradd. This book is really new. It has been published like 4 months ago, and it's available as an audiobook for 2 weeks now. And this video isn't sponsored. Matt has no idea that I'm doing a video about this book, but I hope that he'll find out sooner or later. If you don't know who he is, Fradd is a podcaster who has a YouTube channel on YouTube that is called Pins with Aquinas, and his videos are mostly as long as the book itself, so like 2 to 4 hours. The book takes 4 hours to listen to, so we can compare this really well, whether it's worth the money to buy the book or whether you should stick with the YouTube video. So let's dive right into it. As you might know, I did a video last week with a similar title that was called How to Be Happy, How to Be Holy by Father Paul O'Sullivan. You can watch the video over here. And in that book, I said that the author doesn't really focus on how to be happy, but rather on how to be holy. And we see a big difference from that book to Fradd's book, because here he actually does answer the question how to be happy. He talks about what happiness is, what does make us happy, what doesn't make us happy. He talks about whether sins make us happy, whether following our passions would make us happy. So if you're really looking for an answer for the question what to do when feeling sad, this book really is for you. So let's talk about the content of the book in more detail. The book is really dense in information. I won't be able to talk about everything. That wouldn't be good, obviously, anyways. But I will mention the facts real quick. And please note that every time when I say Matt says or writes, I mean he quotes St. Thomas Aquinas. Most of the time he quotes other saints, mostly St. Thomas of Aquinas. So Matt starts off by talking about a study that has been conducted recently that found out that there is a happiness gap between people who practice religion and people who don't. And this study found out that 36% of people who considered themselves religious said that they are very happy, whereas only 25% of the people who didn't consider themselves religious, who are atheists and the like, said that they are very happy. So this shows us that religion somehow makes people more satisfied with their lives. And Matt goes on and continues about why this might be. By the way, I found the study on the internet, and I have shared a link in the description. He also says that there's a distinction between perfect happiness and imperfect happiness. The first one is called beatitude, perfect happiness, and the second one, the imperfect happiness, is called felicity. And that beatitude, the perfect happiness, is only attainable through God or like in heaven, the like. And then he talks about what doesn't make us happy. He starts off by talking about that. And the first thing he mentions is why sin doesn't make us happy. And here he talks about the capital sins, the 7 capital sins. And he mentions an acronym that helps you to memorize those 7 sins. And this acronym is PALE GAS. I've never heard of that, but it's really helpful. And it stands for pride, anger, lust, envy, gluttony, avarice, and sloth. And this really helps you, especially if you're lying in bed and doing an examination of conscience and don't have a booklet nearby. You can just think of pale gas, whatever image that produces in your head. It's definitely helpful to remember the 7 deadly or capital sins. And here he talks about each of the 7 capital sins and explains what the problem is, maybe the things that most people overlook about those sins, and what to do to solve the problem if you have a problem with this particular sin. And at this point, I have to say that I didn't really understand why he talks that much about the 7 capital sins, but I'll summarize that anyways, and please note that we will get to the topic of happiness later on in the video. So he starts off about pride. He starts off by talking about pride. And here he says that a common misconception about pride is that it's the same thing as self-love. And this is apparently not true, because Pride is self-love that results in hating your neighbor. If you love yourself that much that you start treating your neighbor badly or stuff like that. And this misconception comes from the Bible verses that say that you have to love your neighbor as yourself, which implies that you have to love yourself. So this isn't a bad thing to love yourself. It's just you need temperance in everything. And in this particular case, you have to love yourself, but only as long as you don't hate your neighbor. Then he continues by talking about anger, and here he makes the distinction between zealous anger and unjust anger. So the first one is a good form of anger, and the second one is a bad form of anger, which is sinful. And here we have the example of Jesus in the temple, the cleansing of the temple, where he had zealous anger because people were misusing the temple, and instead of worshiping God, they were like doing other things. And so we have to know that not every anger is bad. The next thing he talks about is lust, and here he says that many people object that if God gave us passions, if God gave us the desire to do certain things, it can't be bad. Why do we have this natural desire? And he explains that by saying that passions are good as long as they're in accordance to reason. And he compares that with fire, which I really liked. He says that fire is good as long as it's in the fireplace. But as soon as the fire burns down your house, it's not good anymore. And that's the same thing with our passions. And another thing that people oftentimes tell him is that in the case of homosexuality, that animals also do practice homosexuality, so people should also be allowed to do that. And I actually think that's a good point, and I really like the explanation that Matt gives you at this point, because he said that animals also kill themselves for food and do other things that humans do not. And this makes it obvious that just because an animal does it, just because it's normal in the life of an animal, doesn't mean that humans should do it too. The next vice he talks about is envy, and he defines that as sorrow over someone else's good. And the solution to that would be to rejoice over someone else's good. So by practicing to rejoice over that, we would overcome this vice eventually. The next thing is gluttony, and here he points out that gluttony doesn't only concern food, but also caffeine, sugar, that's the same thing as food, and alcohol. Then he talks about avarice, which is a word I have never heard before, and this means that you want to have as much money as you can for yourself, or as much things as you want to have, are able to have. And here the issue is that you don't trust God enough that he will provide for you. And there is a Bible verse he quotes, which I would like to read out to you because I really liked it. It's Proverbs 38, and it goes like this. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. And then it continues. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal, and so dishonor the name of my God. So here he stresses the importance of temperance in all things. That's actually a thing he talks about throughout the whole book. And especially in this case, it shows us that it's neither good to desire to be rich nor poor, just the thing in the middle. And yeah, the next vice he talks about is sloth, which is despair about your situation. It's not only laziness, but also if you despair and therefore stop doing anything, stop progressing. And the solution to that would be to find joy in your everyday life, which would avoid you despairing. And another thing I found interesting is that pale gas stands for two different categories of sins. Pale concerns people, and gas concerns other things. And after talking about all of those sins, Matt quotes John Paul II, who said that you are not the sum of your sins, but the sum of God's love for you and your capacity to become who he calls you to be, or of what you can become as the image of Christ. And then he talks about other things that don't make you happy and why they don't make you happy. The first thing is money, which won't make you happy, as we hear all the time from millionaires or billionaires that get asked whether money made them happy, and they say no. But I've heard somewhere the quote that it's better to cry in a limousine than a public bus. So that's the only thing that money would change, but it wouldn't really make you happy. And Matt distinguishes between natural wealth and artificial wealth. Natural wealth is wealth are goods that satisfy natural needs, whereas artificial wealth is money. It doesn't satisfy any natural needs. Natural needs would be hunger and thirst, so natural goods would be the equivalents like food and drink and shelter and stuff like that. And he also writes that things in general won't make us happy, because as soon as we have them, we realize their insufficiency. And I really like that, because that's actually true. I mean, I know that from experience, that I want to have something and I idealize the idea of it in my head, and then I get it and I'm like, okay, it's not that fun as I thought. And another thing that he talks about that doesn't make you happy is fame, because he says that happiness comes from within, and what someone else thinks about you won't change anything inside of you. So if someone else thinks you're great, it doesn't change your feelings. You won't feel happier because of that. And another thing I found interesting is the distinction between fame and honor. He explains that that's not the same thing, because you can be famous without being honorable, and honorable without being famous. For example, Adolf Hitler was famous but definitely not honorable. And then he starts talking about what actually does make us happy. And here he talks about the virtues. First, the 4 cardinal virtues, and then the 3 theological virtues. He talks about each one of them and explains how to best practice them and what people oftentimes don't know about them. And here I would like to point out one thing I found really interesting is that courage is not the absence of fear, but it removes every obstacle for you to do good. So just because you're courageous, which is a virtue, doesn't mean that you're not afraid of failure or anything. It's just that you do it anyways. And I won't talk about each of the virtues in detail right now. I have to leave you something to read yourselves. But I can promise you that it's similarly interesting as the vices I've talked at the beginning of the video. And now I would like to talk about a question Matt addresses in his book, which is what to do when you are feeling sad. And here St. Thomas of Aquinas has 5 methods or steps or things you could do when you feel down. And those are pleasure, tears, friends, contemplation, and sleep and baths. So the first one, pleasure, I've explained that at the beginning of the video. Not every indulging in pleasure is bad. And the second one, tears, whether those are tears of joy or tears of sadness. Matt says that it's in general pleasant for a human being to show what they feel inside to the outside, and you don't have to cry in public, but letting those emotions out helps you. You can compare that the sadness dissipates with your tears, which is a beautiful comparison. And he also mentions the problem men oftentimes have, that they don't cry because they fear that they would appear less masculine because of that. And I can say from my point of view that I never perceive someone like a man crying on YouTube or anything as a negative thing. I don't think that they're less masculine because of that. I actually think that the most courageous thing you can do is to show your weakness, and by crying you show your weakness. And this takes way more courage than doing scary things. Like, this is a scary thing in itself. That the next thing, friends, is obvious, that if you feel down you can talk with your friends about it, and they might cheer you up, but what you have to bear in mind here is that you shouldn't always only take, but also give. So if someone needs you, you should also be there for them. The next thing, contemplation. Matt says, or St. Thomas of Aquin says that contemplating will help you be happier. And Matt says that people would choose intellectual pleasures over bodily pleasures. And when I first heard that, I disagreed, because I thought that not everyone likes to, I don't know, read books or something like that. But then Matt convinced me by saying that if you had to choose between blindness and insanity, you would choose blindness. I don't know if that's true for everyone. I mean, tell me in the comments. But that makes sense, because blindness, you would lose the ability to see the beauty of nature, or would be generally restricted in your life. But insanity would deprive you of enjoying intellectual pleasures. And this is, I think, that really convinced me. And it also reminded me of a quote from Socrates that I learned in school, that he asked the question whether you would prefer to be a dissatisfied philosopher or a satisfied pig. This is a bit harder than blindness versus insanity. I'm not sure what I would choose. Tell me in the comments what you would choose. And the last thing Matt talks about is the problem of scruples many Catholics face throughout their lives. And the solution here would be to know how to know that you are in a state of grace. And here St. Thomas of Aquinas has a method, which is you have to ask yourself whether you know that you can delight in God and despise worldly pleasures, under a circumstance that you're not conscious of a mortal sin. Matt compares being in the state of grace with standing on a mountain. He says that you can't just slip into mortal sin. You have to consciously make the decision to do so, which would be equivalent to jumping off that mountain. And for me personally, it's always helpful to do acts of perfect contrition, because that way your certainty of being in the state of grace increases, and you can go to Holy Communion knowing that with an act of perfect contrition, your sins are forgiven, even if you had subconsciously committed a mortal sin. And I've done a video about that, which you can find over here. Now let's get to my opinion on the book. I would give it 9 out of 10 stars, because I really liked that it provided many helpful tools for leading a happier and better life. And I also appreciate that Matt picked a topic that isn't that common among Catholic or Christian books, and that he actually answered the question of happiness, because the book last week was a bit off topic. And to answer the question I asked at the beginning of the video, whether the book is worth your money or whether you should stick with the YouTube channel Pins with Aquinas, I would say it's definitely worth the money. At least it was for me. You can see how much work went into the book, and I really enjoyed reading it. That's been it for today. I hope you liked the video. I wish you a happy Advent, and God bless. Bye!